afternoon. Well, it's not good afternoon. Our time now is around 10:40, and I'm in Okahumpka, Florida, here in the state of Florida, at a very fine gentleman's home. A historian, a person who's done a lot of work with archaeology and other areas of history. To help us to understand where we're going today, we have an outline of the areas that we are going to cover. We're going to cover a little bit about his hometown, where he lives now, which is Okahumpka, and we are going to cover some of his activities and relationships from his readings about the Indians. Also, he's going to cover some of his family activities relating to the Indians, and the readings mainly are so important to us. We are going to cover not only Okahumpka, and from that area, we're going to talk about the Indians and the Indians' relationship to Rosewood, which was in Levy County, which is in Levy County. From there, we're going to go to Alachua County. And from Alachua County, we're going to talk about Micanopy, the Indians again, and the Indians' relationships to the Paynes Prairie. And from the Paynes Prairie, after we complete that, discuss some activities there, we're going to go over to Fort Mose. Fort Mose is in St. Augustine, Florida, and give the relationship of not only the Indians and Negroes, at that time they were not called Negroes, but anyway, we're going to give the relationships there, and then we will move up to the last area, and that area is going to be the Negro Fort. And the Negro Fort is in Apalachicola. We will summarize and close out our interview for today. We want to thank you so much for your time. And again, I've given the time, and the day's date is the 8th. July 8th, I'm sorry. It is Friday. The sun is shining so beautifully here. It's a beautiful day. It's beautiful sky. It's around 88 degrees, probably going up to around 91 or 2 degrees today. But we're here and we're ready to get started with several questions in mind. Would you please state your full name?
My name is Joseph Branham, and I have a PhD, so I'm Dr. Joseph Branham.
Please give all credit. Thank you so much. And we want you to listen to our first tape so you can learn the details about his life and all of his works and where he is today. And this gentleman is 90 years of age. And he and his wife have a beautiful home here that they've opened up to us and allowed us to come and sit in his beautiful, comfortable office, and also we're sitting in the library area. We've been there, and we're sitting in the living room, and we're sitting on rugs that came from other countries that we won't go into detail about. Would you start your conversation? We'll start the conversation with Okahumpka. Let's talk about Okahumpka and the relationship to the Indians in this area.
Well, Okahumpka is an unusual name. It means one water. It translates as one water, and it was the name of a spring that's in our front yard here, and the spring has changed its name, but Okahumpka has become a town. It wasn't always where it is right now. It was about a mile further northwest originally, because it was serviced primarily during the time of settlement. It was serviced by steamboats that came from Palatka.
Because the waterways were basically the only way you could get in here.
And that's been the case since a long time ago, and this was a major place for indigenous Indians. There were lots of Indian mounds. It must have been a big population of people here then.
And I wanted you to mention again to the people how they got the name for the spring out back, which is 170 feet deep, I believe you told us.
That's right. It's one of the deepest. It's very deep, and the Navy now owns it, and they do sonar evaluation in there.
Yes, and how did it get its name?
And it got its name Bug Springs. I was told when I moved here by the people that I met, they said, oh, a little boy named, a 9-year-old boy, they were pretty specific, named Billy Bug, backed a wagon up, and we was to get water in a barrel, and the wagon was drawn by a mule, and the mule didn't stop, and the boy and the mule drowned in the spring. And we've since found a two-wheeled wagon, a fancy little wagon, and lots of little spokes. It was a fancy thing in the spring. So it became, from Okahumpka, it changed its name to Billy Brown. In the meantime, I did searching the history of the name and the property. It was called Crystal Spring at one point. It was called Deep Spring at another point. And when my father inherited it, it was the Deep Spring Corporation.
Excellent. Well, now let's move in and talk a little bit about the Indians' relationship on this land, in this area.
Well, the Indian name Okahumpka first shows up in the literature in 1813 when Florida was part of Spain, and it was the home for the chief, the third or fourth chief of the Seminole nations. He was actually referred to as a king. The term Miko is the Seminole name for their chief leader of the nation. Otherwise, the king, or sometimes even referred to as an emperor. But he was the king of the water, the pond king, or the pond governor, he's often referred to, and his name was Micanopy. Opie and Okie go together
as water. And so we got the term Micanopy, which a town is now named for his name.
All right.
Micanopy.
And Micanopy was an interesting character. He came here as a very young boy, or a young man actually, from Old Town up on the Swanee River, where his father, Bowlegs, lived. His uncle, King Payne, was killed during the Patriot War, and Bowlegs served as a king, the leader of the nation for a while, and then when Micanopy came of age, he moved to Okahumpka.
Absolutely.
And he inherited the slaves, the African slaves, from his ancestors.
And who were they?
Well, the first leader of the Creek Nation. The Creek Nation was established by a half-breed Seminole, half-breed Creek Indian. His father was a trader. He ran a trading post up in what is now Alabama, and his name was Alexander McGilvery. He was the very first leader of the people that ultimately became the Seminoles. They fought in the Revolutionary War. The Creek Nation was divided. Some had fought for the American side, and the others had fought for the British side. So they were a split nation, and some of them decided to leave and come to Florida.
Yes, let's say a little bit.
Florida was Spanish and receptive to black colleagues.
Yes, let's say a little bit more about Alexander.
Alexander McGilvery was a plantation owner.
That's what I want.
His father, Lachlan McGilvery, had come from Spain as a young boy. He decided he had just a pocket knife, and he was told that you need to go into Indian territory and start a trading post. So he did. There he found a very beautiful young woman that he married. I've forgotten her name now, but you can find her online. She's a very beautiful woman. Yes. And he then became he became a general on the British side during the Revolutionary War.
Right.
After that, he decided that he had to become an American, so he went to Washington and he met George Washington. That's in this book that I put. And the result was that he was awarded an honorary generalship of the American Army.
Okay.
And he was visited by a veteran friend of his named John Pope, who wrote a book.
Right. We're familiar with Pope.
And it's an interesting book to read.
I see. Well, we're going to get ready now to hear a reading, a special reading that's going to be given by one of our PhD students at the University of Florida. And we had not had a chance to really build this up, but can you say just a couple of things about what we're getting ready to have him read?
All right. Under the governorship of Doyle Carleton, the state began to publish a series of books, facsimile editions of old books. And I happened to come by one called The Tour by John Pope.
Yeah.
It's written in Old English, and it's very difficult to read. But this guy set out to visit his veteran friends, including Alexander McGilvery. And he begins his book with this little paragraph.
All right, the paragraph goes, on the first day of June, 1790, I took my departure from the city of Richmond with an intention of visiting the western regions of Kentucky and exploring the Spanish dominions of Louisiana and the two Floridas, as also the territories of the Creek Nation, now under the governance of Alexander McGilvery, Esquire, who from the current approbation which he had merited and received from the whole nation, may with propriety be said to hold imperial power, having many kings and princes subordinate to him.
So you can see that even the Americans considered the leader of the new nations, the Creek Nation in this case, as important people.
Yes.
They even thought of them as kings or emperors.
Exactly.
Thousands of subjects.
Right.
And the subjects, incidentally, were also Indians, but they were slaveholders, and they owned, and Alexander McGilvery owned, a great number of African slaves.
And also, what about the Seminoles? Had they come in here at that time?
The Creek Nation had fought, some of them had fought on the side of the British, and some of them had fought on the side of the Unionists, and they ended up being a nation divided.
Yes.
And some of them decided to flee from the United States and go to the Spanish colony of La Florida.
Of La Florida, that's what it was called at that time, that's right.
And so those people came down here. The Creeks thought of them as runaways, and the Spanish thought of them as wild people, and they gave them a Spanish name that turned into our word, Seminole.
The Seminoles.
And it implies that they were runaway peoples that had decided to become their own nation.
Absolutely.
And they're the last of the 5 civilized nations of Indians that are recognized now.
Absolutely. Yes, there's a very good book written by Anthony Dixon that deals with the Seminole nations. He deals with the First Seminole War and the Second Seminole War. I just wanted to put that in. But anyway, let us go back to the Indians as we're moving forward and see how they progressed in this area, which is Okahumpka, and then how they used the waterways to move toward Chiefland, Florida, and other areas around the water, which was a part of Cedar Key and other areas that were water related, because at that time, goods could only travel by way of water, so to speak. They didn't travel too much by land. And moving the Indians up in those areas was a great feat, and it gave them new land, it gave them a chance to expand, also it gave them a chance to drive cattle and do other things of that nature. So could you share just a wee bit as to how these Indians that were pretty much down here, who migrated up toward not only Micanopy, which was Alachua County, but also to Levy County?
Well, Okahumpka, the spring, is in the Continental Divide, if you will.
Yeah.
We're at a high point. We happen to be in the Central Valley, so the water from the spring that comes into the spring is coming from higher land to the south of here, the Lake Wales Ridge. But after it comes out of the ground, it can flow either to the Gulf of Mexico, and in the early writings about this place, it was considered to be the headwaters of the Withlacoochee River. And the Withlacoochee River goes into the Gulf of Mexico just a little bit south of where the Swanee River does, which happened to be a very important area for colonization, because Cedar Key became a major port city. It also is the area from which the descendants of the Seminoles in Alachua County originated
too, that's right.
Because Andrew Jackson had driven those people down to the Swanee area, and they ultimately ended up in Alachua County.
In Alachua County.
Alachua, which is in fact a name
That's an Indian
existed
name also.
even back in the very prehistoric days.
Yeah, that was an Indian name also.
And the inheritance of the title of King of the Seminole Nation progressed from Alexander McGilvery to his nephew, who was called Cowkeeper, who lived at Cuscawilla, which is now known as Micanopy. And he was the he was the uncle of the man who became King Payne. King Payne left his name on the prairie. King Payne was killed in the Patriot War, which was a violent invasion by the Georgians coming to capture black people. And King Payne was killed then, and his brother-in-law, Bowlegs, who came from Old Town, which is close to the Withlacoochee River.
Absolutely.
Down on the Swanee River, became the temporary king until his son, Micanopy, reached age of maturity, and Okahumpka became their capital city.
All right.
And Micanopy inherited the slaves, and they lived about 11 miles away in their own village, which was called Pilatlakaha.
Okay, say that again.
Pilatlakaha.
Beautiful, thank you.
And Okahumpka, or Okahumpka, or whatever you want to call it. I've got a map that has it spelled two different ways on the same map. And I've found something over 50 different spellings of it used.
I believe you.
And so when you're researching Okahumpka, you have to watch for
all these spellings.
And actually, the town from which Alexander McGilvery came was called Wetumpka.
Oh, that
And
was close to Wetumpka.
It took me a while to figure out that was in fact a related town. And that's in Alabama.
Oh, really? Oh, I just learned a new one. All righty. So now, keeping the waterways in mind, because we know that that was a main way of travel, and also we know that the Indians were the ones that migrated into these areas and started crops, started migrating with corn crops and other crops, bringing in African Americans. At that time they were called Negroes or what have you, or blacks, and they came together, and they came together for security, to help each other so that they could grow not only their crops, but they integrated and they grew their families together, they grew their crops together, they grew their growth together, and they spread it out. And this was not acceptable with some cultures.
But they had to be entitled as slaves of the Indians.
That's true.
Because if they were freed people, Then they were subject to be captured by the Indians, by the slave
slaveholders.
Now, the slave hunters were Indians.
That's true.
The Yuchi Indians from Georgia were raiding the Indians' slaves in Florida and selling them in Georgia. And that led to hard feelings all around. And ultimately, the Indians in Okahumpka got irritated. They were confined to little territories. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek confined them to a territory that reached from about 5 miles north of Okahumpka and went all the way down to what is now Bartow. And, and Okahumpka shows up in that treaty as
and there are a lot of slave
the
cultures
key
in
point
Bartow.
to measure from.
I hadn't brought in Bartow, but so true. I've been down in that area.
And in that treaty, they were promised things like a school teacher, like a blacksmith and a gunsmith, and they were the only white people that were supposed to be going into the Indian sacred land, if you will, reservation.
The culture of Bartow goes way back.
But the military road between Fort King, which is in Ocala, and Fort Brooke, which is in Tampa, went across that property. That got them all upset because the Army was marching back and forth across this territory that had been promised to them. And so they got, and actually Micanopy had gone down to Fort Brooke. He had rented some of his slaves to work for the Army people at Fort Brooke. So they had a close understanding of what the people were doing. One of the famous ones was named, one of the famous slaves of Micanopy was named Gopher John.
Gopher John.
Because Gopher John was just a kid. The commandant of Fort Brooke decided he wanted to try eating gophers, so he asked John to go out and get him some, and John came back with 2. He had them in a pen out in the back, and they decided they liked gophers.
They liked it, and so they started eating.
So Gopher John was sent out to catch some more. He took the first 2 and brought them back and sold them again. And he did that 3 or 4 times. And finally the commandant got caught on to the fact that he was being cheated. And Gopher John became a very important person. Actually, he was a black man. He was a slave. His real name was John Cavallo, or Juan Cavallo. He was a kid. And he ultimately became one of the most important black people from this area.
Okay, wonderful.
He went with Micanopy when they were removed to Arkansas. There he was known as John Horse.
Oh, that was John Horse. I read about John Horse.
And John Horse was now the descendant of the slave of Micanopy.
Wow.
Micanopy's follower, after Micanopy removed, his nephew, Wildcat, became the leader. Once they were in Arkansas, the black people were having a problem because the Creek Indians were raiding the Seminoles and stealing their black people and selling them. And Wildcat decided he could save his friends, the black people, and he got together with John Horse, and they moved the black colony down to South Texas and into Mexico, where they became colleagues of the Mexicans. They were soldiers, so they helped the Mexicans defend themselves from the advancing Texans.
And that brings in a very important question. How many languages did these gentlemen have? Because they said Micanopy could speak and could communicate.
Micanopy claimed not to speak any language except Seminole. He had a slave, Abraham.
Abraham was the one that had the languages.
Abraham had been a slave to a man in Pensacola.
That's right.
And he spoke English. He questionably spoke Spanish, but he became the leading force basically in the army because he was the only one of the Indians, and he considered himself to be a black Seminole.
That's right.
He was the only one, however, that could understand the language of the people they were dealing with.
Absolutely, because they even sent him to Washington and other places
the Indians
too.
didn't know if he was telling the truth, nor did the English. So he was, in fact, the key to doing a lot of things.
Absolutely, that being able to understand the language and to really tell them falsehoods in certain languages so that he could get what he needed to get done.
That's right.
He was really known for languages.
And there's a fellow named Rivers, a professor.
Dr. Rivers, I know him. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Dr.
know
Rivers
Rivers,
wrote
too.
a book about this, and he identified
Larry Rivers, Dr. Larry Rivers.
He identified Abraham as Abraham Grant.
Yes.
And he says in his book that Abraham Grant, after the war, went to Jacksonville and became a minister in the AME church there. But that is not true, because Abraham went to Arkansas and died there.
He died in Arkansas. Well, we have so many stories, and it's so hard sometimes, but I know Dr. Larry Rivers, and I think he would do a very clear research on that. I can't dispute what you're saying and what he's saying either.
Well,
but yes, I have read Rivers' book. He has two books out
he's written
related.
several.
Yes, he has.
Too.
You have that one too. So we're familiar with some of the same people.
Oh, yes.
Yes, yes. And Larry Rivers has done quite a bit with Rosewood. Let's bring Rosewood back in. He was on the committee that helped with the report for Rosewood. And that report went through in 1994 to determine that Rosewood actually existed, because the state of Florida said that it did not exist, that it was hearsay, that this never happened. Well, you had the newspaper reports from New York, you had them from all over the country, you had so many documents, but they said the documents were false. So they had to go out and actually interview family members and people that lived in the community to tell the story. And the best person to tell the story was a white man who was 18 years old when Rosewood occurred. Well, they would accept his story because he was considered an adult. And he was white. And he told pretty much the same story that the African Americans had already told. So they said, well, based on that, we have to kind of believe what has happened, because we don't believe what these black folks say. We don't believe what these other folks say. We know that the area is there, and we know that they said the train stopped there. That was another thing that gave it credibility. The train stopped there twice a day, and it had to have its own water tank. And so those were things that we were able to bring back to life, to say that Rosewood existed and that it was burned down in 1923. And so after the study was done and the interviews were done of the family members and those that escaped from Rosewood, the claims bill passed. And that passed in 1994. And so we're coming up now on the 100th year anniversary, because Rosewood was January the 1st through the 7th. Constant stress on those people, and many of them had to leave in many different ways. And the water wave was one of the ways that they left, that you have already mentioned, saying that they came toward Tampa. Those that could get to Cedar Key and other areas came south. But one thing that has not been mentioned to the public that much, and I'm going to put that in real quick, was that the lumber company, the Comer Lumber Company, realized what was going on, and they sent a train to pick up the men, because the men and the boys were being killed, and carried several of them on the side tracks, you know, not your main railroad tracks, but the side tracks, and got them to La Coochie, Florida. And we just verified that fact recently.
And there's a plaque to them at the Iron Bridge, which is where they...
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, yeah. And it's over in Day City. There's also a train unit there. So we verified that several of the men were able to get out of there by the help of the lumber company. And that had not been shared in the past. Everything was that they came out on the train engine number 3 to Gainesville and on up to Briceville, Florida. That was true with women and children. But many of the men were able to escape the route that we just mentioned. Another route out was by waterway. And we have a dissertation that states that several were able to get out by getting under sponges. The sponge boat was there in the dock. Mm-hmm. And since the sponge boat was there, the men said, as many men as we can get here, we'll put you under the sponges. And they hid these men under the sponges and took them out of the Rosewood area, out of the Cedar Key area, through the Gulf of Mexico, and carried them to South America. And that's where that boat stopped. So we know that people were scattered all over South America, Tampa, Lacucci, Florida, to Archer, Florida, Gainesville, all the way up to Briceville, which was named for the engineers of the train, the Bryce brothers.
And those people were the descendants of the people that were the slaves for Micanopy and all of the Seminoles, because he wasn't the only one that ate a lot. They all owned slaves.
And that's what I want you to mention.
And those people had escaped from the awful slavery in the Americas that were north of there. But they were people with memories. They were people that knew their ancestry. They were people that were distressed by having their families broken up.
Absolutely.
They therefore had a good, strong oral history and related their backgrounds.
They were very well educated people, and they were knowledgeable of things in their community.
Right, and I can imagine that the black community had been slaves of the Seminoles who befriended them. But they were also slaves of the white people, and some of the Indians were good slave owners, and some of them were not, just like every other situation.
But once,
there was an exchange for that. But the black community, they were denied travel. They unless they had a permit. Written permit.
That's true.
And if they could read those written permits, they were beaten to death. It was horrible.
You got that right. Absolutely.
Have you read Solomon Northcote's 12 Years?
Oh, yes, 12 years. I went to see the movie, too.
Yeah, well, I couldn't stand the movie because of the violence.
I
did read the book, and the book makes it very clear what horrors those people were going through. However, the slaves of Micanopy, when the Florida War was over, those people ended up going to Arkansas, and from there to...
That's true.
And ultimately, after the Civil War, they came back and they became rangers for the federal troops. Their descendants, and some of them became the Buffalo Soldiers, and their descendants were still brave people that felt a togetherness, and they became the Tuskegee Airmen.
Absolutely.
All of these people are, and in reading the history of this, it all focuses back onto Okahumpka as a place of their origin. So in Brackettville, I just had a friend who has a relative in Brackettville, Georgia, and he heard this story, and he walked around and looked in the graveyard, and he found a number of graves of people that had been born in Okahumpka.
And could relate that history. That's why we have now people doing genealogy, and it's so important that we do this genealogy to relate the names and the time span. And of course, now the very, very early census did not have us in there. But we had the plantation names, and from the plantation, we were able to find out we were listed with the cattle and the animals, and we were only given a first name, if that, or a nickname, or no name, or listed by age.
And I think I gave you a book that
And
had
you
a
gave
lot of
me
those.
information on a lot of that detail.
Yeah, and the people that owned them were people like Jumper. There's a Jumper
That's right,
Creek
the
over-
jumpers, yes indeed.
And the
But I have to give you one other fact here in regards to Rosewood. We found that the Cherokee Indians from North Carolina in the mountains and so forth had sent people down here
Sure.
to Florida. And the Indians all the way from North Carolina through South Carolina, all the way down, and many of them stopped in Sapelo, in the Sapelo Islands in South Carolina, and learned their culture and a little bit of their language, and they brought it on in. They brought flowers in, they brought the use of rice. You know, rice was a big item, tobacco and other things. These were educated people that came on into Florida and continued to keep their lifestyle going. And then you had journeymen in there, and you had people that were doing building construction and so forth. Those terms are not even talked about with African Americans, but they built some of the best buildings that were ever built. Because of their forms, they knew how to build, and they knew how to build without using a lot of nails. You know, they knew how to interact those wood pieces together.
And the Indians here knew that. That's why they
That's
had
exactly right.
this working arrangement with their black people. The black people were raising corn and gourds and melons.
That's right. And yams and potatoes and all those foods.
And they cleared lots of land. That land has remained
New ground, as they
Indian-owned
called
lands. And ultimately, Okahumpka became the watermelon capital of
It was.
the world. The University of Florida set up a watermelon, grape, and squash laboratory to teach people to learn about raising these crops and continue the tradition that the black slaves of
brought
Micanopy
here.
had actually built here.
That's exactly true. You are really bringing in the history, and you're bringing in parts that people are not familiar with or haven't been able to share. But then another thing I want to say, going back again, just mentioning Rosewood, that they knew where they had come from, many of them out of Africa and out of the islands and so forth, coming to this country. So that information has not really been shared with the general public.
Right.
And once they got here, the integration with the Indians, because they were very close. And when you look at some of the family members that lost their lives, some of them were Indians. And there were many Indians that helped in the fields to keep those people from helping them to escape. They could not have escaped if they hadn't had the Indians in the woods to tell them what to do and how to get food to them and the ways to operate to function. So this is history that we need to bring out that has not been touched,
Well,
that would give us so much more in depth. And it bothers me because our newspapers and so forth refuse to include the Indians, especially the Seminoles. And the Seminoles have devoted their lives to telling the stories of African Americans and other cultures in this state of Florida. Not only in Florida, and other areas as well. And those stories need to be told if they would.
Indeed. As a matter of fact, when I retired from teaching school in 1989, I decided first I would do some genealogy, and I got hold of our family Bible, and I discovered that I had a relative killed at age 23 in the Florida Wars.
Wow.
And I didn't even know that there was a Florida War.
Yes, indeed there was.
And it was not something we taught about, and it's still not something. It's now called the Second Seminole War.
The Second Seminole War.
We've just passed a law that we can't even talk about that now.
Well, that is
because
ever
that's
so true.
critical race theory.
So many things are destroying our background and destroying the history and destroying the truth. That is the issue.
But then I discovered a relationship that I had heard a little bit about. James Spencer Branham was the son of my great-grandfather, who lived in Eatonville, Georgia, was a slaveholder. My grandfather married a young woman who had come from Ireland named Verlinda Harris. Verlinda Harris's sister came to live with them. Valinda's son was James Spencer Branham.
Uh-huh.
Her sister got knocked up by a traveling salesman.
That's a term that
and
we need to tell the audience.
And produced a son who didn't have a father. So he became Joel, which was a Branham name, Chandler Harris, because his mother's name was Harris. And Joel Chandler Harris, of course, became a very famous author. He wrote the story about Uncle Remus.
He sure did.
And when I visited in Eatonville a couple of years ago, I discovered that they didn't realize that there were still descendants that knew this story, because my family had said that Uncle Remus was actually one of the Branham slaves. There are lots of Branhams around here, and they're all black.
All right. Well, let's change a little bit and come back in and deal with Fort Mose. And let's bring it in from the Spanish perspective and also from the Indian perspective as to how Fort Mose was founded. Because it was founded, in the 1500s. And of course, they were with the Spanish, and you know the story of being with the Spanish, and then the Indians were also involved there, and we talk about the waterways, and one was the St. Johns River, and then the Atlantic Ocean, and then them coming in from Savannah and other areas from the north, and then them coming from the south, and then those that were naturally here in the state of Florida they were able to get there and work together and set up a town. And that was the first, town in Florida.
One
of the first.
When I said Okahumpka is at the Continental Divide, and I talked about it going to the Gulf, it also flows, and it does nowadays, down the Ocklawaha River, down the St. Johns River.
That's St. Johns, yes. We need to bring that in. And
this Fort Mose was a black community.
Absolutely.
But you got to recognize that Florida was discovered by the Spanish right after Columbus came over
here, and that was in the 1492.
DeSoto went through in 1539.
Right.
The French settled here too.
That's right. We got to bring them in.
And they got here in 1563, 62, and they set up a fort close to where Jacksonville is now. They arrived there, and it was a big colony. And it was at a time when this area was now named New France.
New France, okay.
It stayed New France for just a few years because the Spaniards showed up and whipped them and sent them home, killed most of them at Matanzas. Matanzas Inlet is a word for slaughter.
Yes.
And they slaughtered the Frenchmen there, but a few of them escaped. One of them was an artist, Lemoy.
Lemoy.
All of the pictures that we have of the indigenous people that those people made, all of the in-person paintings and descriptions of them came from the French. The French were eliminated. There are a number of beautiful books about this. They were eliminated by the Spanish. And both the French and the Spanish had African slaves with them.
Absolutely.
And so it was Florida for a little while with no settlement. The first settlement that lasted just 15 months.
Okay.
And those people actually came up the river. They didn't call it the St. Johns River.
No, it wasn't called that at that time.
They got there on the 1st of May, and it was the River of May, and it was right close to Mayport.
That's exactly right.
And the river north of that was called the Thames.
The Thames, that's right.
And the river, and they said there was another colony that had set up that didn't survive at Charles Fort, which is now Charleston, and the area where the French settled was Port Royal. Both of those names still exist. So the French were, and Paris Island is where
that's
they
right,
landed.
Paris Island. That's Marines go there still today for
the
training.
French left their names, but they also left few people. They also left the pictures that we have and the word descriptions of what life was like, because they came with the intention of trading with the people. The Spanish came with the concept of raiding the people and taking their wealth back to Spain.
Absolutely.
So it was a balance, but the French were very important. But now, after that, the Spanish ran it for a while. They were Catholics.
That's right.
Only people that were allowed to survive were those that became Catholics.
So you had to be a Catholic in order to be a part.
Just before our Civil War, just before our Revolutionary War, the British battled with the Spaniards. They made a trade. The British colony of Cuba was traded for the colony that became the two Floridas, East and West Florida, that Pope visited. And well, let's see, where was I?
Well, you were talking about the East and West Florida, yes.
So the Spanish were here. The natives all died off. The British took it over. The story is, the last 60 of the surviving indigenous people went to Spain, and they were Catholics, and they're buried in Cuba.
Yes.
And that left Florida empty, and that's when the Seminoles came in.
They came in.
And Florida was a British colony when the other 13 colonies were forming the United States.
We're forming the U.S.
So when our Revolutionary War ended, which was in 1883,
that's
a
right,
long time after it started, the Spanish came back to live. So the Spanish, and it was not a very successful time, because the United States was angry, trying to take back their side, and they did. It was a lot of it was an argument about slavery, because
that was the key thing, because Georgia was kicking in on that, sending slaves down here, and then they were taking them too.
The rice farmers and the melon farmers were fleeing to Spain, Spanish colony,
the Spanish colony was giving them protection.
Were having a difficult time. They needed armed people to help them defend themselves from. And that's all in this story too.
Right.
But that's when Fort Mose came into existence, because the Spanish were welcoming black slaves. They didn't. They gave, when they came, they gave them freedom. They gave them guns, Catholics, and they wanted them as colleagues. So it became a fort.
That's exactly right.
All black people defending against the United States.
Exactly.
And inland from that fort was the Seminole village of Cuscawilla.
Yeah, Augusta.
And
right down the road.
And King Payne's province.
Yes.
And those black people were fighting with the Spaniards and the Seminoles against the Patriots from Georgia.
We got to leave Georgia in there, because they were.
The Patriots left their name too. McIntosh, for example,
is one of the names. That's true.
But McIntosh was one of the Patriots, white people. But McIntosh was also a name that came down from the Indian side from up in Georgia.
And it also came all the way out of Michigan too.
Right.
McIntosh, and it was all the way up into Canada.
Of course, they were the French.
Because that's exactly right. So we're not going to go there today, but we could carry McIntosh all over in those areas.
The French fur hunters and,
that's it.
And the British traders that were trading the wares from Europe for the furs from the Frenchmen. And what the Indians had to sell, corn and such things.
Absolutely. Well, let's change a little bit here. We talked a little bit about St. Augustine, and let's go to the Negro Fort area now that's up in Pensacola. We're leaving the Atlantic Ocean portion, and then we're going inland on Florida, and we're going up into the Panhandle, as they call it.
Up the
Apalachicola, yes.
To where it branches with the Flint River and
That's
the
exactly
Chattahoochee
right.
River.
The Chattahoochee.
And at that point, Florida was still a Spanish colony. The Americans, Andrew Jackson had beat the English in the War of 1812, and he was left with something else to do, so he invaded Florida. That was the first Seminole War, which has other names too.
It had other names, but that's okay.
At that point, the black slaves had come to the Pensacola area, up the Apalachicola River, just in from Apalachicola, and those people were also colleagues. They were there, they were armed, they were given what it took to defend themselves against the advancing American frontier. And a British ship came to resupply them, went up the river.
That's right.
They were firing their cannons at the Negro Fort, as it was still called.
As it was told, that's right.
And they cooked their big iron shots in an oven until they glowed red, so that when they landed in the fort, it would set things on fire.
That's what it did.
One of those landed in the magazine where all the cannon, where all the gunpowder was stored, and it blew up and killed almost everybody.
You're right.
And you find numbers that range from thousands to hundreds and it probably was about 100 people got killed, and a few of them escaped and came down and joined the Seminoles.
Well, very few of them escaped. Very few of them escaped, and the stories on that is just horrible. We were there.
And you can still go and visit that.
Yes,
it's a national memorial.
Absolutely, yes. As I said, we took a busload of students there for the 200-year centennial. And they gave us the stories and carried us to the grave areas and told how that magazine blew up. And when it blew up, the people were thrown into the trees. Some were thrown a half mile from where the area was. It was just horrible how they destroyed that area in such a short time. And
I don't know if you know about it, but the Battle of Horseshoe Bend had occurred just before that, which was another slaughter.
Yeah, that was another slaughter. Well, we're going to have to close this out today. I am just so impressed with all of your knowledge and sharing so much with us on the various areas. I'd like for you to just bring forth a closing here. And I think how we want to close it is just to mention overall what we have covered today. We started by talking about the area that you were raised and the area of Okahumpka and how it has been sort of like a focal point for so many things here in the state of Florida. From that, we talked about the Indians, and we talked about the First Seminole War a little bit. We talked about the Second War, Seminole War. We talked about how the Indians had migrated and worked with the slaves at that time, and talked about how they had operated in various parts of the state, such as in Alachua County with the Paynes Prairie and the Paynes movement. We talked about Micanopy, the area of Micanopy, the town that exists today. We spoke in terms of Rosewood, Florida, as it related to Levy County and relating to how things were moved about with the ship movement and so forth in the Gulf of Mexico. We've talked quite a bit about Fort Mose, which is in St. Augustine area, and the growth of that area and how things have progressed over the time span. Then we left that area and gave sort of a general coverage of the Negro Fort, which is in the Apalachicola area, and we talked quite a bit about the Spanish today, and we brought in the French, because that's so important to our history as well, to understand what they did and how they operated. We said very little about plantations, but we did mention those as to how they were interactive and the leaders that owned plantations. This was a clear point that you gave us here so that we could understand how things were done. And of course, we even talked about a few stories that you gave us, the stories that will help us to understand how people move from one place to another place, and not only how they moved, but the stories that they kept in their minds and how they shared their genealogy from one family to the next family or from one individual to the next. I tell you, we have covered quite a bit in this day. We covered Old Town, we covered Chiefland, we covered many, many places here in the state of Florida. And I want to thank you for taking your time and your energy and your knowledge is just outstanding to let us know that history is always changing. Not only is it changing, we need to tell the truth, because so much truth in our history has never been shared. And it's so important that you continue this genealogy. And every family should do their genealogy background so that they will know where they came from, how they got here, who their family members are, and a little bit about their culture that they had not even thought about. We want to thank you. The time now is 11:30, and we are in Okahumpka, Florida. And of course, as I mentioned today, it is a beautiful day. We're on a beautiful plot of land, and we have had an opportunity to share history with each of us. I'd like to ask Adolfo, if you would like to have any additional information that you'd like to share, or any questions that you'd like to ask that I did not cover.
I think we covered an array of questions beforehand. We even talked about how we were going to break it down, and I think we've done a marvelous job asking the questions. I'm looking forward, hopefully, to another interview. I mean, there's so many topics to talk about, but I think for today, we've gone through all the topics necessary that we discussed.
Well, thank you so very much. And we want to thank everyone for taking their time to send questions to me, because I did receive some questions that we did not cover. But there's going to be another time, and we will share more. And we probably will be doing more of these interviews on Zoom so we can interact and share. So if you have questions that you'd like to send to the University of Florida, to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program in Gainesville, please do so. This will be available to you on YouTube, so you can view it, and then you can send your questions, and we can save those for another interview, because we will have another interview to share more of the history of Florida that has somewhat been omitted from our history books and from our culture. Thank you very much. My name is Sherrod DuPree, and I am so pleased to have this opportunity today. We are closing out the interview. Again, it's at 11:40 p.m. And the day's date again?
A.M.
A.M., I'm sorry, A.M. And the day is July the 8th. And again, it's a beautiful day to be in Florida. Thank you.
And that Seminole War ended in 1842, and that's when the settlers came in and these towns began to get their names, and that's where we can pick up next time.
1842.
1842, that was
when the settlers came in.
Then there was a third
That's
Seminole
true.
War that started and lasted just 2 years. That was in 1852 it started.
Well, 1852, yeah, then that was after this, almost after the Civil War, because that's when we got so many of these plantations that I'm familiar with. 1884 was when most of those people came in here from South Carolina and Virginia, migrating south.
Of course, I'd been reading about the war, and I was doing research in the history library in Tallahassee, where my son was working.
Oh, that's right, your son was there.
He introduced me to Joe Knish.
Oh, I know Joe Knish. I've worked with Joe Knish.
And Joe Knish, when he found out I was from Okahumpka, he said, "Oh, I just found paper about Okahumpka here.
That sounds
here.
like Joe.
And what it was a petition that was signed by about a dozen people in Okahumpka complaining about a Captain Jernigan who was trying to incite a third Indian war.
We already had two,
Well,
that's enough.
If you don't know that story, you should.
Well, I need to get with Joe.
Because it turns out that was happening everywhere in Florida.
Oh, really?
Because Captain Jernigan was a captain in the Third Indian War. He was a militiaman, but he was also a cattleman.
Cattle was big business in Florida.
And his cattle ranch was where Orlando is now, and the original name for Orlando was Jernigan.
Was Jernigan.
I didn't know that.